Hi everyone, in this video I'll be going over 8 watercolor techniques that I believe that every beginning watercolor artist should know. Those techniques are wet on wet, bloom, dry paper towel, salt, sea sponge, splattering or dipping, using rubbing alcohol, scratching, and then last is plastic wrap. So let's jump into it. The first technique that I want to go over is probably the most versatile technique in all of watercolor. This is wet on wet and the different textures that you can actually create with a wet on wet process. What I simply did here is I took a large piece of cold press acid-free watercolor paper, split them into different squares to be able to work on these different examples. The whole purpose is to be able to have the pigments mix with one another directly on your page. So rather than mixing your pigments on your palette, what you want to be able to do is mix the paper or mix the pigments directly on your page. And that only works when you are actually doing it in a wet and wet technique. Ultimately, there's multiple different ways that you can do it, but if you can see, as you add in a little pigment, what will happen is the two colors will mix with one another. But that's the first technique, is how to do wet on wet mixed directly right here on your page. The second technique is how to lift white back into your page. When you're doing watercolor, one of the very first things you should think of is, where are my whites? Normally you want to just leave the page white as a first option. But say you're painting and you want to remove pigment to be able to bring white back into your page, one of the best techniques to do that is using a paper towel. Now I have two in here. The reason why I have two is most of the time when people first learn this technique, they start off with a dry paper towel and they just come in and remove pigment from their skies to kind of create clouds. What happens is if you use an immediate dry paper towel, oftentimes what you can see is you'll make an imprint of whatever's on your paper towel right on your paper. So a more advanced technique, what I recommend, is taking a paper towel, having it be damp, and then coming back with the same type of technique, just dabbing along your pigment and removing it from your page. Follow the process again. Dab that out to create those cloud structures. The third technique is using salt. Now this is a classic watercolor technique to be able to create a texture in your background as if you have little stars or snowflakes. Now it's important to have enough water on your pigment before putting in the salt. The reason why is if you let it dry, then there won't be anything for the salt to actually soak up. Now after you put your salt onto your page, you're gonna have to let it dry. But you might see that quick reaction of the water soaking up into the salt. Now I'm gonna go ahead and set this aside so it has an opportunity to dry, and then I'll come back after it's dry so you can see the effects. Awesome, let's look at this painting. It looks like the paint has dried, so I'm just rubbing the salt off. Now, when you're using this technique yourself, you can either randomly throw on the salt or strategically put it in places that you want, but it's a cool effect that can happen right here with your watercolor. The next technique I want to be able to show you is the effects that happen from using a sea sponge. If you're going to come in and say you're just putting in some different types of trees out here in your background, often when you're using just a brush, you'll be limited to the natural look of these different types of trees. So if you come in with a sea sponge, you can naturally see that the different divots and the different formation of the sponge itself will naturally create a different technique onto your page. You can either just paint your pigment directly onto it. You don't want it to be too wet overall because it won't create the effect that you're looking for. But if you come in with that sea sponge and you just drop in different techniques, it will be able to create a more natural looking vegetation. And always come in with some different color to create different layering in your pictures. This next technique is creating drips onto your page. Now, some might ask, when would this be appropriate? Say that you're trying to do a landscape and you want to have splatter of dust or a dirty road or even marble, and you want to get this technique. Rather than drawing it in, what you want to do is you want to come in with your page and simply knock your brushes against each other and let the paint be splattered. Now, this is one example that you can do. Another is actually just using an old toothbrush, where you can come in and put pigment on your toothbrush and you can splatter it on as well as a technique. I have to admit, this next technique is one of the techniques I have not experimented too much with. I've seen it quite often online. It is using rubbing alcohol, similar to salt, where by using rubbing alcohol, it will create different types of textures right onto your page. So I have simply here some rubbing alcohol, and I was going to just drip and see this technique. Hopefully we'll zoom in here so you can see the effects of what this rubbing alcohol is performing. It actually reminds me if you were doing a snow scene and you wanted to have little snowflakes falling from your sky. But I have to admit, it's one of the techniques that I have not experimented enough with, but I think after this video, I totally will. One of the ways that you can do this is by using an X-Acto knife or the edge of a sharp knife. Now, it's important to know that you don't want to cut your page. What you're doing is basically removing the top layer of your paper to be able to leave a white streak back in here. That as you come back in, you can scratch off just the top layer of your page to be able to leave behind a white highlight. The last technique today that I want to be able to help demonstrate is using simple plastic wrap to be able to create texture with your watercolor. Now, this is something that you can actually use with like a grocery bag. I have here just some plastic wrap, for keeping food. The important thing is to make sure that you have enough pigment and you have enough water on your page before adding your plastic wrap. The other important thing is, as you add your plastic wrap on, you have to find a place for it to be able to dry. So it's as simple as that. You just put the plastic wrap onto your wet paper, and now you just set it aside for an hour or so, let the pigment dry, and then remove the paper. Okay, here's the plastic wrap. It's been drying here for at least 30 minutes, so I'm gonna pull the plastic off so we can see the technique that came from it. Not bad overall. Pretty unique on how the paint ends up drying here on the piece of paper. Hi, I hope you enjoyed those 8 different techniques that any beginner can use in watercolor, and I wanted to show you a couple of examples from pictures that I've done with some of those techniques. The first example here is a poppy painting that I did, and I want to draw your attention right in here. If you can see, this was the wet on wet technique from the background with the yellow and the blues intermixing with each other overall. This was also a use of a drop or a splatter technique with these different, farther distant, flowers in the back of the background as well. So that's a good example of being able to see both of those techniques. Another example of one of the techniques in here is using the process of scraping your paint to be able to leave behind the white. These aspen trees were used actually with a credit card rather than with an X-Acto knife. And the credit card was used to be able to scrape and remove part of the pigment to be able to keep part of the pictures white and brilliant. Other portions in the back were done with the wet on wet technique and then dropping in other pigments on top of it as well. During the Christmas season, I did quite a few different Christmas cards, all with the technique of using a toothbrush. So this is a good example right here where the snowman was actually blocked off, so then that way it was protected. And then on the outside was a splattering technique, simply using the toothbrush to splatter the paint all the way around to create the technique of, snow falling from the sky. As mentioned earlier, this was 3 months ago, did a video with the different types of salt to be able to see the different effects that happen. The rock salt definitely and the kosher salt were the two of my favorite. When it came to table salt and sea salt, there wasn't huge of a big difference overall to my liking. And the most important thing to be aware of was the red Hawaiian style salt did leave some coloring pigment back onto the page overall. One more example is this sailboat. The sailboat had a technique of coming in afterwards with a dabbing or the dry towel to be able to remove different highlights within the painting itself. But as you could see, that I hope is that none of the paintings is typically one technique or the other. Just like a carpenter who's trying to build a house, he isn't just going to use a hammer and only a hammer. He's going to have an entire toolbox of tools to be able to help him accomplish these techniques. It's the same with painting. You want to have multiple techniques that you want to use to create multiple different textures, which definitely give your pictures a greater variety. Hey, thank you so very much for making this far. If you made it this far, please consider subscribing. I'd greatly appreciate it. I'm planning on releasing new videos with new information about techniques and art on a weekly basis. So enjoy painting, remember to share the love, and have a fantastic day.